Hey folks, and welcome to an interview. It's been a long time since we've done an audio interview here on Polyhedron Collider, but I'm happy to welcome Jesse Bergman and John Kimmel, both of Punchy Entertainment and developers of the Battle for Sularia card game. A couple of weeks ago we had a chat over Skype. It does mean, with it being Skype, that in a couple of places the audio quality does drop. I do apologise for that. I also do apologise that if my vocals seem a bit off, because unfortunately I had to post-record because my headset microphone was, quite frankly, awful. So, without further ado, I'll get you straight on to talking with John and Jesse. Enjoy! So let's kick things off and talk about your history in gaming, basically. So how did you get into gaming? What kind of games do you enjoy?
Question. Do you want to answer first, John, or you want me to go?
No, go for it.
Okay. Well, so for me, my background started at a young age. Obviously, more video game related than not. My early days, I was one of the few in my group of friends to have a Nintendo. And so I played, Mario and Zelda and all of those things as a young child. But then as I started to get older, I started going to the comic book stores and things like that in my local community. I started meeting people that were playing role-playing games and tabletop games back then. Obviously, my family always played, your standard evergreen Parker Brothers, Hasbro games out there like Connect 4, Monopoly, Risk, those kinds of things were always around the table. Sorry is still one of my favorite games, just because it's so sarcastic, no matter what. But so then, as things progressed and I got older, I met John, and when I met John, he was a salesperson. Well, worked at the hobby store that I bought my comics from, and John was like, "Oh, you should check out this really new card game. It's pretty awesome." And that new card game was Magic: The Gathering. And that was probably the first time I'd ever dove into a card game experience of any sort. And obviously, like everybody knows, Magic went on to become an uber success. And at the time we were playing in the Alpha and Antiquities days, so it was very, very early on, and we really had no idea what that game would evolve to in terms of competitive play and all of those kinds of things. So as I got older, I continued to game and board gaming for a while, and then, PlayStation and 3D graphics and all the enticements of technology at a young age kind of lured me back to the video game world for quite a while. And I actually didn't play a lot of board games during that period of time. It was kind of an area that kind of got lost to me for a little while. And I went to school and got a degree in game design. I graduated from UAT in 2009 with a bachelor's in game design and specifically video game design. And it kind of the way things worked out, John and I started working on a game project to make a video game, and ultimately somewhere along the line realized that we missed playing tabletop games, and that really came from prototyping a video game onto a tabletop. And when that happened, we really ended up shifting the focus of what we wanted to do and started making tabletop games instead of video games.
Did you ever get around to actually making that video game, or were you now just concentrating on board games?
No, we never did. Lots of concepts, nothing that ever made it to final, nothing that ever made it into an alpha stage or anything like that. And a lot of what we ran into is, some lack of technical, like a game design degree is kind of a jack of all trades degree. I have just enough of a knowledge of programming to be dangerous. I got just enough of a knowledge of 3D modeling to be dangerous or be really slow. One of those things. I've got just enough knowledge in just about every aspect, from producing a video game to, the legalese end of the video game world to whatever it may be, that it kind of put me in a place to design games, but not necessarily be fully equipped to build something from the ground up from scratch. It was a degree that I got really familiar with working with inside engines and scripting. So I kind of call myself a script kiddie when I work on things. And then the rest of it required somebody with a much more precise knowledge and a very skilled expertise in an area to complete. And so John and I struggled for a while here in our local community to find somebody that wanted to jump on board as that technical expertise person in terms of programming, network infrastructure, all of the things that come to be expected in modern day video games, even in indie games at this point. So we kind of shifted gears and looked at some app stuff for doing, like, for phones and not necessarily games per se, but like gamification type stuff where we could use corporate infrastructure. And really, it's kind of a hot topic still even to this day with the gamification end of it. But we ultimately landed on we were going to make tabletop games, and that's kind of where Battle for Sularia came in to the mix. So I'll let John tell you his gaming background, and then we'll move forward.
So I'm a little older than Jesse, not by much, but a little bit. So I had a Nintendo, but I go back a little bit further. I had like an Atari, and my cousins had a Pong system. We'd play back and forth like Atari a lot. But I also grew up in an era where like D&D first came out, early 80s stuff. So I did a combination of video games and tabletop games and board games. What drew me to all those games, no surprise, but visually I was always into art. So the art always drew me to those games. And to be fair, probably the games that drew me in the most once I started getting into my teenage years and working at a comic book / hobby store were the Games Workshop stuff. I was really fanatical about collecting all the White Dwarf magazines and drawing like all the artists in the magazines. So I was really there was a part of me that one of my childhood goals at the age of like 11 or 12 was to win a Golden Demon painting award and get the Golden Demon like Slayer sword. I was like fanatical about trying to do that, and it kind of lost a little bit of its luster when Games Workshop expanded, and now there's like all these different painting contests all over the world, and I can't win that one that's in the UK, right? So I'm a little bummed about that, but no, so that was my thing. I did a combination of all of it, but what drove me to everything was the visual, the art side of it. That drove me in my movie interests, my gaming interests, even just like books I'd pick up off the shelf to read. I literally judged everything by its cover. So as Jesse mentioned, I was working at this hobby store, and him and his friends, who were actually coworkers of mine, that's how we all kind of got together. And Magic was that icebreaker for a lot of those, at the time I'd say kids. They weren't really into D&D yet. Games Workshop was something they looked at, but sometimes miniatures, while that was interesting to a number of guys in the group, and they got in on it with the miniatures, at the same time, that required maybe too much dedication to paint everything. And so a game like a card game like Magic coming along was perfect because they didn't have to paint anything. They could just start playing a game. They didn't have to do a lot of role playing per se. I mean, a lot of guys I remember liking D&D, but were kind of turned off by, they didn't want to act out anything. They just wanted to like play a game that was kind of thematic to what their interests were, which were either fantasy or science fiction.
Yeah, I'm just interject really quick there. Yeah, I mean, John is a heck of a painter of miniatures. He's really good at it. So when my army would be painted across the table from his army in 40K, it was rather depressing.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's funny you say that, because I was kind of like so I would teach, I'd have like a painting class, and I would teach kids at the hobby store if they wanted to learn how to paint miniatures to paint. And but I always had that adverse reaction where I would almost drive customers away at the time because
he was so good at it.
They're like, well, I don't know how sexy this interview can be, but they were not necessarily happy. So that's what happened. Yeah. So fast forward a number of years, I went to school for I got a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree with an emphasis in graphic design. And I had actually worked for a software company for a while in the mid-90s. It was a educational software company. So I did a lot of art, but it was for like kids games. But they were all Macintosh and PC, edutainment is what they called it. And somewhere in the early 2000s, I really felt kind of like off the grid, so to speak. in terms of gaming, I think working at that time, I was burning out, and I got like the corporate job and was doing the corporate grind. And Jesse, I think, was kind of doing the same thing. He was still doing his gaming on the background, but we weren't really like, none of us were thinking in terms of doing anything with our interests. And then Jesse went back to school about the same time I went back to school. And when we both got out of school literally about the same time too, we both realized like, man, this is our second chance to get this right. Let's combine our forces and make some shit happen. And so that's what we did. And the first thing that we did was focus on a video game, because that seemed like the logical step for us to do. But as Jesse mentioned, the technology wasn't there. Or I shouldn't say that, not the technology, our ability to code some of this stuff. We didn't have that skill set. I had an art skill set. Jesse had a game design skill set. So we knew what we wanted to do, and we knew what we wanted it to look like. And I could do some of the art assets, but I couldn't do the things that we needed to have done, and we didn't have a coder. So before we were like, well, let's just see if this stuff works. And we made a board game version of it. It was in that process of making that board game version that we realized, man, and this is ironically prior to, I think, either one of us really being dialed into what was happening with Kickstarter yet, as well as that we were somehow inadvertently falling into this golden age of tabletop games. Like, I don't think we had no idea.
Right.
So we were making this board game. We're like, man, I forgot how fun it was to sit at a table and play a game, like, and not be on a headset playing with a bunch of people over the interwebs, you know? So this was really exciting to like have this sense of, wow, this could be a real thing. And then we realized that, oh, this board game's, it's not there. I mean, to be blunt, it's like, this sucks.
Yeah, our first game wasn't very good.
It was just, I mean, because it was functional, and it would probably worked great as a video game, but in terms of a board game, the funny thing is we let that one go away. And not to go off on too much of a tangent, but what really instigated us to not give up on the card game was we backed off that board game. Some life events happened. And Jesse and I basically took about a year off from doing anything with games. And when we came back to the table and like, we got to get back on track, one of the motivators was we went to another local hobby store here in town, and it caught my eye. I'm like, that looks kind of like, wait a minute. And I was like, Jesse, come over here. That looks just like the game we were working on a year ago. So there, basically it was kind of an iteration of Blood Bowl. Less, it was like that. It was kind of the sports themed tabletop board game, and I'm blanking on the name of it right now. Not that it matters, but this new version, this other company,
I think it's called Dreadball.
Dreadball, that's it.
Yep.
Our game was like Dreadball, and I looked at it, I'm like, wow, thematically it's similar to what we had, costume wise, or what they look like. I'm like, dude.
From a visuals perspective, it was almost a mirror of our concept.
It was super deja vu based on my sketches for what I was wanting to do with our version of it. And so I'm like, well, whatever we do for our next game, we got to stick through to at least getting it completed. Stick through to completion. If it takes off, great. If not, at least I won't come back a year later into this hobby store, see another game of ours on the shelf that we didn't finish.
Yep.
So that's really the biggest motivation at the time to make this game happen. And I guess this is a good segue as to what were the origins of Battle for Sularia.
Yep.
That Jesse can take off from there.
Yeah. So for me, I'm a big RTS player. I'm awful at them. Just to give you a heads up. So if you're really good at StarCraft, we're not going to play it anytime soon because you'll just crush me. But I love real-time strategy video games. I've grown up on Command and Conquer, Warcraft, StarCraft. All of those games had meaning and value to me. Of course, even after first-person shooters came out, I still played a lot of first-person shooters, obviously. But I still always kind of brought myself back to real-time strategy games. I've played, I don't even know, so many different offshoots of those kinds of games. And I really wanted, when I set out to make Battle for Sularia, it was a concept that had come out while I was in school. I had written down just a page of stuff in a notebook about it. And I said, all right, I'm going to throw this aside because this is a card game, and I'm not going to ever make a card game. I'm going to school for video games. I'm going to go work in the video game industry. I just don't see myself making a card game unless it's a digital card game, and et cetera, et cetera. So really what pushed me on Battle for Solaria was creating a 2-resource system like you would find in a real-time strategy game. I wanted to manage that. I wanted to have tech trees. I mean, the original design was very RTS and very kind of crunchy and grindy, and ultimately, well, by the time I really got done with the concept, when we revisited it, when I found that concept, I revisited it and started fleshing it out into a real design document, which took me about 4 months in total. I took it back to John and showed John, and he goes, yeah, I think there's something here. We'll have to play it and see. And so we tried a game of it, and we were 3 hours into a game, and there was no clear victor. So we went, okay, well, some of this stuff's really cool. Some of this stuff is just a lot of tedium and kind of monotonous, and just kind of drags things out and kind of eliminates what are the really cool parts of the game. And so, kind of went back to the drawing board and really narrowed the thing down even more. At this point, I'd only had the 2 factions that are currently out designed. I had 2 other factions already in mind for a design perspective, but I wanted to make sure the game operated, from a certain point before we move forward with a bunch of card design, card testing, all of that sort of thing. So I kind of took a systematic testing approach to it. So for me, like, Battle for Solaria is really a tribute and a labor of love to the card games that I've played in the past that I loved, combined with or melded together with real-time strategy video games. And so that was probably the 2 things that I really wanted to convey in the game. And I think we've done a pretty good job with it. There's still areas that I wish we could, explore that real-time strategy component a little bit more. But it's really tough with regards to gameplay and making it fun. There's something about when it's happening and you're pushing buttons on a keyboard versus when it's not happening, and you're watching your opponent do things and then you're doing things, and it slows the game down into a kind of a grindy slog fest that wasn't looking to convey,
So let me get this right. It's a 2-player card game in a similar vein to Magic. Is that correct?
It is in that sense. It is designed as a competitive head-to-head dueling game. However, lots of casual multiplayer modes are available in terms of how you want to play multiplayer. The battle kit itself will support 2 players out of the box. So the retail release packaging, you can grab a single copy and grab your buddy and start playing right away. And then, if you guys really want to start diving deep into that deck customization and the deck brewing that you find in it, your Magic style games, or your Yu-Gi-Ohs or Pokemons, or just about any card game out on the market, you probably are going to find that each player wants to have their own kit at that point. They're going to want to customize decks to play the way they want to play, and then their friend may not like the way that plays. So it just but that's kind of what we hope is that as somebody gets introduced to it, they want to start customizing their own decks, and they go get their own copy of the game as well.
So, yeah, how does this game work straight out the box? Because several games of this nature, you tend to find when you open the box, you could have got half a game. You've got to add extra cards.
Yeah.
So how does Battle for Solaria work straight out of the box?
Yeah, I mean, I think, because we're an indie publisher, we ran into a couple of things from a business perspective. It was roughly, what would it be now, John, 2 years ago? Maybe 2.5?
When we changed the model?
Yeah.
Yeah, about 2.5. And just quick interjection. It is a 2-player competitive head-to-head style, but you can also do a 4-player draft.
Yep, right out of the box.
Out of the box.
And 4-player draft is a ton of fun if you're comfortable with the mechanics. I wouldn't recommend new players try to draft our game and start learning the game from a draft perspective, because there's a lot of little nuance in the draft format that you're going to have to know how it operates because of just the way the cards are specifically limited in design. But so I mean, from that perspective, I think we did a good job of creating 2 very different starter decks in the base kit that allow players to get a lot of games with a lot of variability in those games without making any changes to the decks. So, I think from that perspective, I know plenty of players inside our test groups who are, 50 games into testing these starter decks and going, I'm still seeing ways to do things different. which is, to me, is a sign we did pretty well. There is a downside to that, though, and it is the downside that one faction in particular definitely plays better for a new player than the other faction. And so a new player picks up this faction and plays it, and they think, oh, these guys are OP. You know, they're the number one best. You know, this is what I want to play all the time. When the reality of it is that over a course of logging thousands of games, we've only seen a slight advantage to them in the form of about a 2.5% advantage over a 50% win ratio. So, I mean, we did our due diligence to make sure that when players of various skill levels attach to these starter decks, they can find depth and complexity well beyond the first couple of games. But, you know, the downside of that is that first impressions are everything. And so maybe that wasn't the right move. You know, when you look back, hindsight's always tough. And so when you start seeing people in the wild playing your game and you hear this kinds of feedback, you go, maybe we should have just made it the two different factions just be a little more vanilla with both of them, you know, and then the downside to that, of course, is that, you know, players that really get into card games go, well, this just feels pretty generic. So we really struggled, you know. I mean, that was a tough decision to make because we had to narrow the scope of our release down so far. I mean, like when we released the battle kit, our battle kit was released at 21 unique cards for each faction and 3 unique mercenary cards. So a total of 45 unique cards in the kit times a play set of 4 leads up to the 180 cards you get in a battle kit. So when we had the designs for all of our factions done, by the time I was all said and done and we had fully tested, I mean, we've got 4,000 plus logged hours 4,000 plus logged games of Battle for Sularia in our testing environment right now. And those games were done with a card pool that was much larger 2.5 years ago. And so we had to scale all of that back because we looked at our art costs and our distribution costs and our, you know, all of the different components of making this a viable retail product and said, okay, you know, we're just 2 guys with a limited capital budget. You know, we're going to take it to Kickstarter and do our best. But even that was, you know, we started doing research on Kickstarter and going, oh, you know, if we want to do Kickstarter, we can't put it out here with black and white test cards. We need to put it out there with full art and, you know, all of these components built and designed and have videos up, and all of that costs money. So how are we going to make all of that happen? And so it really did force us to kind of scale back the release to a much smaller model than what we really would have loved to do. I mean, if we were a big player in the industry, sure, absolutely. Yeah, we would have released this with 4 factions and, you know, probably somewhere in the realms of a core set of, you know, probably 400 or 500 cards in a core set, you know, that kind of a thing. And we just couldn't do that. I mean, we just
could I add to that, Jess, just a little bit? So, as Jesse mentioned, we would have loved to have had this come out as the full, at the time, 262 cards, I believe it is.
Right, unique cards.
Full collectible trading card set. But I actually think, and this just, I think this is a fair statement to say, it's not a biased one, that sometimes the limitations yield you better results overall. Like if you have these parameters, you actually end up with a better product. So my point being is that the end result that we have, while it's not as many cards, it did introduce this system of the construction cost system, which is borrowing from miniature games. I think it's fairly unique for card games. I think maybe in the course of our 2-year demoing of this, maybe one person mentioned some other card game that may have had it, and I don't even remember the name of the card game now.
I think the closest thing you could really attribute it to is Mage Wars.
Okay, so each card has 1, 2, 3, or 4 construction costs. So what that immediately did, it kind of created a situation where it started bridging, I guess, genres of games. You have your miniature players that like to build armies on a point system. Now you have a card game that you can build armies on a point system. It also created a sense of balance, but also created a sense of value for every card. One of the things I really liked and kept drawing me back to the game as we were developing it, especially once we developed this system, and made me like this system more than what we originally had, was because now unlike games like Magic where you buy a pack of cards and literally so many of those cards are fluff cards, like there's really no point. You're paying a lot of money for a lot of junk you'll never use. In our game, literally every card has a value of some sort. When you start building a deck and you have to have at least a minimum of 60, you have to have a minimum of 60 cards and you can't exceed 90 points, you really start looking at every card at that point and giving every card consideration for building your game. So to be fair, yeah, we don't have as many factions in that starter kit, but players get fully play tested, pre-constructed decks that they can start playing with right away. Plus those additional cards in that deck starter kit that really allows you to customize. So that gives you a lot of versatility. You wouldn't, if you're comfortable with that, you don't have to buy anything you don't want to buy. So if we offer an expansion, you could buy it, but you don't have to. And the game's still going to be really balanced either way because we're play testing all these new cards with our existing starter kits, with our existing cards.
Right.
So it's not like we're designing within, I don't know, a bubble, if you will, where each time we look at an expansion, we just look at those cards. We look at everything that we have, which I'm sure other card companies do, but we're very aware of that and try to make sure as we develop expansions, not only are we still pulling from our original 262 card set, because we're releasing these in smaller quantities, we may have to tweak or create a whole new card just so it doesn't break anything as we stage these releases.
For sure. I mean, as we look at the meta, the meta that evolves from the planned release of new cards and things like that, we have to analyze a lot of data to figure out where we're at.
So when did you decide to take this new approach? At what point did you decide, instead of standard deck building, you're going to have this point system like a miniatures game and set decks?
Well, we kind of landed on it by accident more than anything. I mean, just being completely honest with you, so one of the things that was going on was we had at that point I had somewhere probably right around 3,000 to 3,500 logged games in our playtest environment with 262 cards, unique cards in the pool, and we had about 18 playtesters working on it, in various capacities, and all of those were volunteers from around our area. And basically it was going, okay, I got a lot of data. I know how this faction performs, and I see how this faction performs and how well this faction does on initiative versus off initiative, and all these different things that were mechanically driven based on the game mechanics operating a certain way. And then I started going, okay, well, if we have to scale this thing down, how do I pick what cards, right? How do I pick what cards are going to be good, bad, and different or whatever? And of course, like John had kind of mentioned, when we originally set out to do this thing 4 years ago, we said, okay, we'll take a dive into the trading card game market. So we'll randomize distribution, we'll create that sealed play format, those booster draft formats, all those different formats that people love to play, and we'll do that in the Battle for Sularia world. And well, I mean, really, it became a business decision. Like we started, number one, we looked at what our art costs were going to be, and then we looked at what our production costs were going to be and how much product we'd have to bring to market because of minimum order quantities for the handful of printers that can do randomized distribution models, and all these different things. And it really started to approach a dollar figure of like needing $250,000 to make that game a reality. And we said, wow, I mean,
that sucks.
Yeah, so we literally started meeting with investors, venture capitalists, to see if they would be interested in investing money in it. And of course, there's actually, Nebraska is kind of funny. Like it's called the Silicon Prairie. So there's a lot of tech companies that start up here. And so there is a lot of seed money flying around in our community from venture capitalists. And so it wasn't really hard to find venture capitalists that would take meetings with us. It was really more difficult in the fact that if they were going to give us $250,000, why should they give us $250,000 over this new tech startup, that's on the cutting edge of technology, not some analog, old school card game idea. Even when we showed our competitors market share and some of those things, they just said, it's not an enticing enough market for us. And I mean, it's fair. So, we met with one investor in particular, and his investment advice to us was, how do you make this game yourselves? How do you get it out on the marketplace and grow this product yourselves by bootstrapping it instead of looking for outside funding. And so John and I kind of took that to heart and came back around to this idea then of getting rid of the randomization and turning it into an expandable card game format. And so when we did that, I said, okay, so now how do we pick cards, right? Because some cards, they had rarities assigned to them at the time. They had, all these different things. They were designed sometimes around their rarity. Sometimes the rarity didn't really truncate the design as much as going, well, we know this would be a really good card in this format of play. And so it created a lot of different challenges, but ultimately we landed on going, what if I took and I assigned a point value to each card based on its rarity right now? And I said, that's kind of like building a miniatures list. Like, I'm playing X-Wing or I'm playing 40K or whatever, and I have a points, and each unit's worth a point. And so my common cards are worth a point, and my uncommons are worth 2, et cetera. So the more powerful a unit is on the battlefield, the higher it should have in a construction cost. And so that was kind of the fundamental for landing at that point. Now, we had no idea what to set the upper threshold limit at. We went, what's the top, is it 100 points? Is it 150 points? What's the level that we want to set there, on a 60 card deck? And I had a ton of deck lists. We've had an internal deck building tool for about 3 years. And so I started going through all of our deck lists, and I was calculating their points. I was figuring out how many points each one of those deck lists were. So I ended up narrowing it down to about the top 15 performing decks that we had out of those 3,500 games. And I said, where are these all at? Where are they at in terms of points? And surprisingly, most of them landed in about 115 to 120 points. And now when I say top performing decks, I'm talking about decks that were winning, 70% of the time. I mean, well above average. And we're going, okay, that's kind of a scary thing. How do we adjust those things? And so for me, 70% is way above and beyond what a deck should perform consistently, because that doesn't really make it fair for your opponent if you're going up against that deck. And so ideally, obviously, you want the 50-50 mix, right? You want a deck that wins 50% of the time, and obviously we all know those numbers don't ever really happen. You can get close, but they're never quite right there. And so then I started creating some thresholds. And so ultimately what I found is those decks were all averaging, with the exception of one deck, all of those decks were averaging about 115 points. And so I went, okay, if they're all averaging about 115 points and we want to kind of scale the power back a little bit so they're not performing at that 70%, I'm just going to pull back to an arbitrary number of calling it 90. That's really honestly how it was decided. It was like, here's a bunch of decks that are averaging 115 points that are winning 70% of the time. Let's pull that back to 90 points, and let's see what those decks operate like when you can't put all of the components in.
So we all had to rebuild all those top performing decks.
Yep. And what we found out was really all those top performing decks instantly came into a line of running about 53% win, 51% win. Gone were the 70% win ratios. Now they were down in the ranges that we felt were an acceptable range. And so I mean, instantly we were like, okay, this works really well. Now I got really scared though, and I said, well, does this mean that this is the only way people are going to play? Like, there's only going to be one deck to rule them all, kind of a thing. And so then what I started finding though is that was completely the opposite. Like, all of a sudden people are going, oh, if I have to rebuild this deck, I'm not going to invest 3 points in this card, even though it's a good card. I'm not going to put 3 points into it. I want to go back over to this 1 point card, and I want to add more of these 1 point cards because it performs better, more consistently, and it doesn't cost me as much in construction. And all of a sudden my deck lists went from having 10 or 15 cards or 10 or 15 lists that everybody was running down to it was like all of a sudden it was exploded. I had like 5 different decks from 5 different people all the time. I mean, they were coming in they were spending more time outside of the game crafting new ideas for deck building than they were inside the game even trying those ideas. Like, it was phenomenal. Like, cards that people had just forgotten about, they're like, oh man, this is amazing. Cards
that were kind of stinkers all of a sudden became like awesome.
Yep. And cards that were awesome were still awesome, but you just paid for them.
Couldn't afford. Yeah, it's like, I can't have that many. I have to have only 2 or 3, or if I'm lucky, if I can, only 1.
So we really liked all of a sudden the choice that came into deck building using this system. And so it served 2 functions for us. Number one, it served the function of being able to create unique deck building ideas in the game. And number 2, it said, oh, now all of a sudden these decks aren't overperforming because they can't overperform. And it worked out really well. Like I said, it wasn't something we came on to by choice, or wasn't in the initial design choice. It was really part of the iterative process of testing and then finding out that we couldn't financially build the game we wanted.
So this resource system, does this mean you've got like two sources of resources now? Like your mana you typically have to bring out cards, as well as the deck building resources?
Exactly, yeah. So the two resource system is definitely part of the resource management component, and it's definitely, I don't think it's like anything else on the market right now. I really truly believe that. The influence row, you can make some attributions to the influence row similar to like the WoW TCG that's on the market today, or hearkening back to the Versus system. But really it serves as the primary generator of your base resource influence, and that grows at a linear rate of 1 per turn. And that influence is used to establish sites out onto the battlefield, which serve not only as your second resource generator, Sularium, but they also serve as your defensive points. So really, in Battle for Sularia, attacking and defending isn't about necessarily dealing as much damage. You still have to deal damage to win the game, but it's more about how do you resource deny your opponent, because if you don't properly do that, he can get back into the game, or he can be really powerful. And so, it was really one of those conscious decisions that we wanted to have these two resources and that operate. So, when you talk about mana, the best I ever tell a player that talks about mana is our sites are your lands. That's what they are, but they're land with teeth. They have their own attack and defense values. They have their own unique abilities. They have all of these different things going on that make them nothing like a land you play in Magic. And then you turn around and you go, okay, well, the influence is kind of like land too, but then you go, no, really influence operates like a second hand. I'm putting cards down there that don't have strategic value to me at that particular moment in the game, and then I can access them at a later time to use them to surprise my opponent, gain an advantage, put powerful conditions on the battlefield that change the way the battlefield operates for the rest of the game. There's so much strategy and depth there with that influence row that it's hard to call those land too.
So yeah, it's quite interesting. You seem to have really three different kinds of resources. So you've got your basic, you've got your two in-game, which are your equivalent of the mana, and then you actually have this out-of-game one, which is your deck building. It must lead to some really interesting ways in which you can approach the deck building mechanics.
It is really interesting. Even with a small pool of cards, there's a lot of really competitive decks. That's beautiful to me. Like, yeah, sure, you might find like Jotun players all using one or two of the same card. That's cool to me. But then the quantity of how many they run on this side or that side or whatever, it's fantastic. So, we've been super excited about the deck building component, and anybody that's been a long-term card game player, they don't take very long before they want to dive in and start building their own decks. And that's when they go, holy cow, there's a lot here.
Well, one of the things I did want to touch upon was the artwork, because one of the first things that came to my attention when looking at Battle for Sularia was, quite frankly, the amazing artwork available. And most of us, the first time I saw it was the Kickstarter, and I think you came out of the gate quite strong with such a strong and unique and very well-looking art design. So I know, John, you mentioned you've got your background in art design. Was that something you both envisaged right from the beginning, or was it something that just evolved as the game development progressed?
No, so I guess I'll answer this one, Jess.
Yeah, that's a good one for you.
All right, so I really wanted to do all the illustrations myself, but that wasn't going to happen. So that being said, I kept asking myself, okay, as Jesse was designing the game, he brought me on early on and was like, okay, I want you to create a look for this game, one that you think is cool. And I also knew I have a pretty good sense of what Jesse likes as well. And so he kind of gave me a little free rein. At time, I was maybe stepping on some toes here and there, but ultimately, I wanted the art style to be, if possible, as good as everything else that I liked. So that was my starting point. And then I realized, okay, from an artistic style, I gravitate, I think, just to be competitive in the marketplace, it had to be this paint and release style. It didn't have to be digitally painted. It could be traditional painted, but it needed to be this paint and release style. I think you see a lot of new products in the market, and it's okay that some of them do this. I like comic book art a lot too. I like clean black and white line work that's, colored well. I think there's definitely a place for that. But in our game, we weren't doing a comic book. We were doing this science fiction epic, if you will. And that kind of forced our hand. It's like everything has to be as good as at least maybe my worst illustration. And I have one in there, and I'm not the happiest with it, but if they're all better than what I did, we're going to do good.
Yep.
And when I get time, I'll personally go back and get my game up higher. But I focused on making sure that we had a host of artists, that one we could afford, and that took some doing. Two, all had a comparable style of falling into that painterly style. And then I am the graphic designer, so all the art you see that's not an illustration, that is my work. So the card designs, the icons, all the graphic design, all that stuff, that's me. And so I wanted to make sure that whatever we had from illustrations also complemented our graphic design well. And I think it does. My big concern was, I think another maybe, I guess purely an opinion on my own, but I think a lot of card games right now put too much illustrated related material like in the design of the cards. So I wanted to have a card design that complemented the illustration but not pull away from the illustration. I wanted the illustration to be the feature and the design to support that. I think there's, and not to say that these are bad at all, they're awesome. I'll just use this as an example. Games Workshop licenses out their IP to various different companies, and Fantasy Flight Games is one of them. And they have a card game called Conquest. For the most part, their art's good, and a lot of times it's amazing. But I think they almost went overboard on their design elements, and sometimes I think it competes with the illustrations. That's just my opinion, but so I wanted to make sure I had a nice painterly art style and a graphic design style that supported it and featured it, but not distract from it if possible. I'm not a big fan of, like, my design didn't have to like literally infuse and integrate into the illustration. It just needed to support it.
Well,
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and I add a little bit to that. You know, I mean, I'm a guy that I don't really care how a game looks. Like, I can play a game that's on black and white cards. It doesn't bother me one little bit as long as the game is fun to play. But John is a huge visual guy, and so that was why all along I wanted John helping, you know, in terms of him and I working together to put something out, because I knew that John would bring a visual level to the game that I would not be able to do. And I'm not talking purely a skill standpoint. You don't want to see anything I ever draw, because I'm pretty sure hand turkeys are the extent of my drawing capabilities. But it really is, you know, it was about him having the vision artistically to direct people to bring to life this world that we were wanting to have this conflict in. And I had laid out the conflict to John and you know, what it was all about and stuff like that, and that was part of what got him into the idea of it. So then it gave him a lot of room, and I did want him to have the room to go out and really explore, is this lore in depth enough? Is this fiction where we want it? Is this visual style going to work? Is this kind of mentality for what they're representing going to work, you know? And so now it kind of all interacts together. Like, we actually, when we design new cards now, not only are we designing new cards based around mechanically how the game operates, but we're now even designing new cards based around how the factions have kind of grown, you know, if they were in the world, you know. And so that's kind of a new approach, because when I started it off, it was literally just a mechanical design process. It was going, yeah, I've got these guys, and this is what they fight for, and I got these guys, and this is what they fight for. And so they've got these different abilities that are based around how, you know, what makes them their strengths and their weaknesses. And that was literally the design approach I took in the beginning. And that evolved drastically as we started developing and fleshing out these factions and the lore and the backstory for them and the characters and all of these different things.
Yeah, it's come out really well. I mean, you've got what I would consider a good marriage of the artwork between that kind of artwork style and graphic design have come together really well. I mean, there's a UK developed card game, it's a collectible card game, and it seems that it went through a very similar journey as yourselves. And that they were going to go random booster packs and had to change their style based on what the demand wanted. Now, they've got fantastic artists, but I found that they had issues with marrying that with the graphic design. The graphic design really didn't match the quality of the graphic of the art. Now, one of the things I did want to talk to you about was the Kickstarter, because this was your first Kickstarter, and that was the first time we actually saw the product when you came straight out into Kickstarter. So, how did it go, and what did you learn?
Kickstarter was quite the learning experience, Stephen. I'm going to tell you now. And it was also 30. We ran a 37-day campaign because we wanted to tie it in. We had a convention near the end of the campaign. And so we wanted to run through that convention time to help us, uplift our pledges, because we were going to be running demos all weekend long. And so we timed it based around that. And all things considered, for our first Kickstarter, things went, better than it could have gone. There's no doubt. We could still be sitting here today trying to get the battle kit out, and not getting there. So, from a management perspective, we did really well. But we learned a lot, too, about what the Kickstarter marketplace is really driven by. And we didn't realize that probably as well as we should have, even though we had done months of research before we ever even started putting the first words to a preview page. It just didn't matter, and it comes up so fast on you, too. You go, okay, we're going to launch this Kickstarter on this date, and, that's 4 months out, and you go, okay, we've got 4 months to get that ready, and you go, oh, that's plenty of time, blah, blah, blah. Next thing you know, holy crap, we're going to launch that next week. Where are we at on this, So, we learned a lot from that. We also learned a lot about stretch goals, add-ons, things like that, and what people wanted, expected, which was something that, we had looked at some models, but, a lot of the models you look at, you're most made aware of Kickstarters, like the zombie sides and the exploding kittens and all of these, mega Kickstarters. And they pretty much, for the most part, break just about every rule.
Yeah.
If you really look at it from an indie game publisher perspective and what needs to be made to make a successful indie game, on Kickstarter, you can't really follow their models because they pretty much don't care about the model. And so we really, the most of our valuable information came from reading blogs from like Jamie Stonemeyer, Stonemeyer Games, and, or Stegmeyer, sorry, his Stonemeyer Games. And then also, James Math and his blogs related to Minion Games and their Kickstarters. And these are guys that are making a living. And Jamie, I think, is now starting to escalate into the upper echelons of Kickstarter people at this point. I think ended up doing like $1.6 million or something a couple of months back. So I think he's starting to get himself beyond what would be called an indie publisher perspective. But James Math is still kind of operating in that realm. I think his most successful Kickstarter he just had, it was about $135,000 funded, which is fantastic, and we're super excited for him. But they've provided a lot of information on how to do things and what they've learned, and that certainly helped us avoid a lot of mistakes. But you still have to make some of your own mistakes, because my game's not the same as Dead Men Tells No Tales or whatever the latest board game from an indie publisher is on Kickstarter. So, we had to tailor it to our game. And when you start tailoring it to a card game, we don't have as many options. Like when you look at a board game, I can upgrade the board, I can upgrade the box, I can do all kinds of different things. In a card game, that starts narrowing down and what you're really capable of doing as far as making premium stuff for Kickstarter. And it's just kind of makes it a little bit of a different challenge. But we learned a lot from it and how to go forward with it from there.
So, do you consider it a success?
Yeah, well, for sure. Getting funded is always a success, man. It was 37 days of me not sleeping, I can tell you that.
Well, the reason I ask is because you hear about these Kickstarter projects who falsely lower their initial goal and hoping to make it up in stretch goals and end up losing their house because they haven't actually made any money out of it in the end.
Right. Yeah, we were very conscious about that, and I had a goal in mind when we set out to do it. And I said, "Here, whatever we do, we can't set a funding goal that's less than $15,000. Like that's all. We in other words, like we can't go under that, and we can't go over it. it's got to be that number. And the reason why was because we knew what it was going to cost to produce. We knew what it was going to cost to ship. We knew and by the way, that was all still more so. It's even at the end of the Kickstarter, we're still not in the black. We also have, I've been fortunate enough to have a good career that's allowed me the capital to continue to, keep this business running and Battle for Solaria moving forward. We definitely haven't broken even yet. I can promise you that. And even at $15,000, we would have been okay, except we made some capital decisions after the end of the campaign to proceed forward with development in the command pack. So the first expansion, which we announced 2 weeks ago, is coming to Kickstarter April 5th. And we have that fully developed and done now. So I could have held off on doing that until we had everything done for the battle kit, but because of the capital I had available, we felt pretty confident we could go ahead and start development of that. So, I'd say it was a success. Anytime you can run a Kickstarter campaign, get it out the door near on time, and go over your funding goal, and provide some stretch goals to your backers and some exclusives to your backers in that respect. And
being completely new, no one knew who we are.
Yeah.
So
yeah, we spent a year on the convention circuit, literally out there, going to every gaming con we could possibly go to, demoing the game, and at times showing the game with just John's graphic designs and black and white watermarks saying Battle for Solaria where the illustrations were. That's how we started. So we were out there for a long time, traveling and just trying to get people to know and recognize the game. And yeah, so I think we were definitely successful. We hope that we can continue to use Kickstarter as a platform to leverage more success until we don't need Kickstarter as a platform anymore.
Yeah, I joke, not to interrupt just briefly, I joke a little bit about we messed up, not so much that we messed up, but as Jesse mentioned, we learned in the course of this that the models that we looked at before launching, things change rapidly on Kickstarter, and I think it's a fair argument that when we finally did jump in, a couple things happened. One, the model for promoting and marketing games on Kickstarter changed a lot, like literally at the same time we jumped in. And at the other time, you had to be very cautious about June and July months because you run into Gen Con. And we found out a number of people were messaging us saying they wanted to pledge, but they were saving their money for Gen Con, and were we going to be at Gen Con and maybe they could buy it. We did not expect that would be such a thing.
Right.
So we learned our lesson.
And the other thing was also, we launched in June and went up against some pretty large players. White Wizard released Epic a week before we launched. Epic raised $780,000 as a card game. It was literally running on Kickstarter for 3 of our 5 weeks.
Yeah, that was something else we got said too. They threw their money at it was Epic, and there was another one.
We went up against Rivals Bones as well, which raised $4.2 million during that Kickstarter.
Yeah,
and then we went up against Zombicide Black Plague at the exact same time. So you have 3 major games all funding for Zombicide and Rival Bones went well over. I think Zombicide Black Plague was like 3.2, and Rival Bones was like 4.
I even threw money at it.
And then Epic was another $780,000. So between those, you had almost $10 million in 3 games. Board gamers had spent their money. And you start going, well, we're just this little guy. How about somebody look at us? We've got a really passionate fan base. The people that did pledge to us are passionate about our game, and that's how you start. So we're super excited about that and the leverage that's created.
Yep.
So I'm just looking at the Kickstarter page now, and I can see that everything from the original project's done. You've sent out all your pledges.
Everything's fulfilled. Yep, we're done. So
you briefly mentioned that you're going to be heading to Kickstarter again for some expansion. So what's next for Battle for Solaria?
Yeah, so for this year, the goal for Sularia is to get 3 expansions out this year. So by the end of this year, we'll have expanded all of these 2 factions additionally, further added more mercenary cards, which further increases the deck customization substantially because mercenary cards can be used in any deck construction or in any faction. And then we'll add 2 new factions by the end of the year. So we've got some pretty bold plans. It does require our Kickstarters to be successful, obviously. Working out some deals right now to get some distribution overseas in Europe and in the UK. So we've been working really hard on that end to get Battle for Solaria into distribution. We weren't taking the approach of the Kickstarter that was going to be a one and done kind of thing. Battle for Solaria begs for a lot of expansion, and it begs for a proper marketing model. And I've had a business and sales background for a long time now, so I was very familiar with what we needed to do to get that done. And so we're working those deals out now. I mean, hopefully, the more people know about us, and the more they talk to their local store owners that are not carrying us right now, those kinds of things, the more we want to expand that retail reach. We want to expand that distribution reach, and really turn this into a game that has sustainability for years to come.
So are you planning on running just the one Kickstarter this year, or will it be 2 or 3?
No, it'll actually be, it just kind of depends, I guess, on how well we do. I mean, if we're looking at it, I mean, the prudent look at it is to look at it at the worst case scenario, and that's just getting enough money to get, to make the next product and to make the next product and so on and so forth. And so when we look at that and what that looks like, then we look at 3 Kickstarters this year. But if the next Kickstarter launches in April, and that's for our command pack, which is called Blood, Profit, and Glory, that's a 56 card expansion, so it comes with 14 unique cards. It'll have 4 new cards for the Jotun. No, is it
2?
No,
I'm wrong. It's 3.
3 new cards for the Jotun, 3 new cards for the Scythian, and then it will have 8. No, I've got that wrong. It is 4 new cards for the Jotun, 4 new cards for the Scythian. Boy, my brain's not working today. And then it's 6 new mercenary cards. And so that there we wanted to have something that had a huge impact on the meta, since we weren't able to get a new faction out quite yet. And so we needed something that really changed up the way you play with the Jotun, changed up the way you play with the Scythian, and then in turn introduce these really powerful mercenaries that can be used anywhere and offer all kinds of new ways to think about how to play as a Jotun or a Scythian player. And it's pretty incredible. The meta is going to shift drastically in the sense that cards that you think will never be unseated as cards you would ever want to play, all of a sudden you're going to start thinking about, boy, maybe I will pull that out for this, which is what we want. We want players making that choice. So, yeah, I mean, it's the expansion is not required. In fact, when in our expansion play testing, which we did all since the end of our Kickstarter up until the end of the year, we tested this expansion. Basically, the base battle kit's competitive, even in pre-customized decks. So you can grab a base battle kit, customize the deck the way you want, and if somebody's playing with the expansion cards, there's not going to be an automatic win for them. So
are you consciously trying to avoid that power creep then?
Absolutely. Yeah, we want compelling cards that make you want to buy new cards, right, to try them and play them. We don't want it being something where you have to buy it. You go, oh man, this card I really want to play with that card, and if I play with that card, I'm going to love it. But if I don't want to buy it right now, I don't have to, because my deck from the last expansion or whatever is still solid. It's still going to operate really good. We really try to be conscious about that and really work hard towards that.
Cool, yeah. So where can people stay up to date on what's happening with Battle for Sularia?
Yeah, probably the best way to stay up to date, of course, is from our website, sularia.com. So it's SULARIA.com. Obviously, we post everything there all the time, but we also use Facebook, so you can find us at Battle for Sularia on Facebook. You can find us at Sularia BCG on Twitter, Sularia BCG on Instagram. We also, if newsletters are your thing, we have a newsletter sign up on our website. Please feel free to sign up for the newsletter. That's a good way to do things, but that only comes out about once a month. So, if you don't want to be bombarded with it, but you just want to get the monthly highlights, the newsletter is a good place to go with that. We're active on social media. We've brought in a team of 3 people since the Kickstarter that are all doing different things for us, but probably the biggest one that I want to mention here is that we brought in a creative writer named Matt Oakes. And Matt has taken our fiction to levels that are well beyond what John and I ever envisioned. And he's really bringing this world to life. So if you like science fiction and you like short story science fiction pieced together into an episodic content, then Rumblings of War on our blog is where you want to be all day long.
Well, thanks very much, guys. Thanks for taking the time to be interviewed by myself.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for interviewing us.
Excellent, guys. Thanks for the help. Cheers.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
Awesome.
Have a good one.
Thank you.
I'd like to take this opportunity again to thank John and Jesse for taking the time to answer my questions. If you have any more you want to hear from Battle for Sularia, they've let you know where places to go. If you want anything else from Polyhedron Collider, you can check out even more interviews at www.polyhedroncollider.com. There's also going to be more videos, our regular podcast. Stay tuned. Thanks. Goodbye.